I'm Dr. Mark Hatala, and I want to welcome you to my office. I'm a cognitive scientist who studies time travel by replicating days from the past. So everything that somebody would have been exposed to, from early morning newspapers through late night television for any particular day. In this case, December 7th, 1972. Now, the CBS Evening News is the subject of today's video, and Walter Cronkite was the anchor from 1962 to 1981. And he was considered to be the most trusted person in news, that if he said it, then it must be true. Now, he passed away in 2009, but the news from the day, this is an important video because what did people on December 7th think was the important news from that day? Now, most of the articles, I put the video up on timetravelsimplified.com, and so you can take a look at the whole thing there, the entire news broadcast. But I want to focus on just a few stories because the lead stories for the day are things like the Apollo 17 launch, the Paris Peace Accords with Henry Kissinger talking to the North Vietnamese, and there's a 6-minute article or news story about a new Secretary of the Transportation. And so one of the things that you notice is that they used to spend a lot longer on individual stories. But I want to cover some of the things that I think are interesting, but maybe you didn't realize was going on December 7th, 1972. So let's get it started with an assassination attempt on Imelda Marcos, who was at the time the First Lady of the Philippines. I think it's interesting because Walter Cronkite goes out of his way to say that she's a former beauty queen. So let's take a look at that.
Death scored a near miss today just outside Manila. The intended victim was Mrs. Imelda Marcos, wife of the Philippine president. The 42-year-old First Lady, a former beauty queen, was attending a civic awards ceremony in the town of Pasay. Hundreds looked on as Mrs. Marcos greeted dignitaries and other guests, all of them wearing traditional white Filipino shirts. Thousands more watched the proceedings on nationwide television, and suddenly up walked a small man in black. From his left coat sleeve, he pulled a big bolo, the knife used by peasants in the Philippines, and lunged at Mrs. Marcos. She managed to get her hands in the way of the would-be assassin. That, some say, saved her life. Shots rang out as security guards grappled with the attacker. There, Mrs. Marcos is helped away, badly cut on both arms and hands. Her attacker lies dead or dying where he fell.
That attack on the First Lady committed by somebody who I believe that...
Mrs. Marcos finally was carried away on a stretcher. Remarkably, almost unbelievably, only 3 persons other than Mrs. Marcos were cut in that furious assault. Their wounds were said to be minor.
By the efforts of the criminals who attempted actually sort of...
The dead attacker was searched by the guards. So far, he still is unidentified. Mrs. Marcos was flown by helicopter to a hospital where 75 stitches were required to close her wounds.
75 stitches is a lot, but I guess it's a happy ending depending on your feelings about Imelda Marcos. The next story is about the overuse of antibiotics, which is still an issue in our time. But I think it's interesting because even 50 years ago, people were concerned about the overprescription of antibiotic drugs. But let's take a look.
The Senate investigation of over-the-counter drugs heard medical testimony today condemning the indiscriminate use of antibiotics. The director of the Bureau of Drugs, Dr. Henry Simmons, said this usage leads to perhaps tens of thousands of deaths a year by unnecessarily creating tougher bacteria.
The last story I want to focus on is about a fire on the USS Forrestal. And it was allegedly set by a sailor named Jeffrey Allison, who they say was experimenting with LSD. It seems that he was more likely it wasn't so much he was experimenting with LSD, he was into full-scale research on it. But he's worth looking into more because he eventually escapes from prison. But let's take a look at that story too.
A military judge today sentenced a sailor to 5 years in prison for what's described as the biggest case of sabotage in U.S. Navy history. 19-year-old seaman apprentice Jeffrey Allison of Oakland, California, was found guilty of setting a $7.5 million fire aboard the aircraft carrier Forrestal. Bob Schieffer reports from Norfolk, Virginia.
Forrestall was undergoing repairs here when the fire broke out. Navy investigators never found a motive, but they claim Allison confessed. The young seaman was apprehensive as he entered court today, but maintained innocence, saying investigators twisted his words. His father, a California highway patrolman and a 10-year Navy veteran, stood by his son's story.
He said he definitely did not do it because he was looking forward to his trip to the Mediterranean, and he said, I wouldn't set my own ship afire. That was his own words, and I believe him.
Well, I don't think there's any question that in view of the evidence we've heard and our own beliefs individually, that Jeff is right in the continual maintaining that he's innocent, that in view of the state of this, that we have legitimate legal issues to appeal and that we will.
There was testimony during the trial that Allison had been experimenting for years with LSD. The Navy did not allege he was under its influence when the fire broke out, but there was evidence he brought LSD aboard 3 days before the fire. In asking for a stiff sentence, Navy prosecutor Kenneth Green said this incident brought to light the Navy's worst fears about mixing drugs and shipboard life, a problem still unresolved. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, Norfolk, Virginia.
I'll put the link below so you can watch the full episode of the CBS Evening News. But if you'd like to be a time traveler, I would encourage you to buy my book, The Final Apollo Mission, for December 7th, 1972. It's guaranteed, the methodology is guaranteed too, that if it doesn't feel like a time travel experience, I'll happily refund your money to you. Please also like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support my research, I put a link below to my account on Patreon. Now, I usually end these videos by wishing you a good day. And I do wish you a good day. But I want to give Walter Cronkite the last word for today.
And that's the way it is, Thursday, December 7th, 1972. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News. Good night.